But oh, thank you. Thank you so much. So something to really, I'd say, remember and just be reminded of. And of course, as counselors, you're like, yeah, I know this already, maybe, but it can be easy to get caught up with like everything's getting so much harder. It's so much more difficult. And, we know the reality is that students can still be admitted to really amazing colleges that will have great outcomes for them, affordable options for the family, that don't necessarily have to be these highly selective schools. But we also know that that commands a lot of national attention and international attention. And it commands a lot of, for many of you tuning into this call, a lot of your bandwidth and the way that you spend your time with students and families. So of course, we're going to acknowledge this and stand with this truth before stepping into the other truths of this presentation. But yes, we're going to be focusing really on highly selective schools today because that has been, when we polled our audience at College Essay Guide time and time again each year, this is consistently the area that counselors in particular are looking for more support around in understanding. So that's what today's all about. So first things first, what is the job of an admission office? A very basic question. And the first answer that I'm going to put here is basically that, like, no matter what college or university a admission officer works at, their job is to get BIS, butts in seats. Their job is to get qualified students who can do the work and will likely graduate on time based on their academic preparation from their courses, their GPA, maybe potentially their test scores. And they have enrollment targets and objectives set by their college's leaderships, as well as objectives to maintain the relevance of the institution in today's market. I say market very intentionally because, yes, education is transformational, but also, yes, and it is a business. And the more that I think you understand that this business side of enrollment management is a really beating, pulsing piece of how this process works, no matter the school. The priorities will look different from school to school, especially depending on things like selectivity. But any college wants to rise in rankings because the jeopardy right now of not doing that is that we're reaching an enrollment cliff. There is, in theory, less students that are going to be applying to four-year U.S. colleges. There's a lot of skepticism about the value of a four-year college degree. Some, states, I think, like Massachusetts, are piloting three-year college degrees, like Australia and other countries. So, yes, colleges are going to want to do things to try and run up their rankings. And some of the easiest and best way to do that is highly qualified academic students, as well as other tactics that lots of schools like sneakily do. Like UChicago, if you just Google some of their antics, they have a whole history legacy of like how they've tried to shoot up in rankings. And it's very fascinating to read about. And then at less selective colleges, usually also, and for most colleges in the United States, other than the really, really small hyper selective ones that have tons of money, tuition revenue is usually a really big institutional priority for an enrollment management office, bringing in the money to keep the lights on, to keep the professors and the administrative staff and all staff members paid, and to keep everything going, basically to keep the college afloat. When you get more selective, that's when you're going to see things like, for example, demonstrated interest factoring in more or less with certain schools' processes, right? Because now you're less just thinking about, okay, let's just send out acceptances to whoever would be a good button seat and just hope that we get them. You're now wanting to make sure that, okay, you're in this kind of new echelon, maybe for some schools, of like moderate selectivity. You want to keep that momentum going if you're an enrollment manager, to be honest, right? And ways to do that is to lower your yield rate, right? The amount of students you send yeses to. If the amount of those students that say yes based on your amount is high, you can have a lower acceptance rate, and it's actually qualified leads. Essentially, if we were thinking about it as a business, these are students who have some evidence that is documented in their file of potentially enrolling, as opposed to a stealth or ghost app that just appears in an admission officer's queue. This is also usually the range of selectivity. We're going to say things like program-based admissions really playing a factor. One great example of this is UIUC, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. They have kind of a more moderately selective overall admission rate. If you look at it, just the overall acceptance rate for every single population, international, domestic, in-state, all the majors. But when you start to break down those international specific admit rates, out-of-state admit rate, admit rate for computer science, admit rate for computer science plus X. They're more like interdisciplinary computer science program. You're going to be seeing a lot of different numbers and a lot lower numbers. And that really speaks to, for many more moderately selective colleges, the pressure to maintain academic balance and to evenly distribute students across different schools. You even are hearing of many colleges considering dropping and eliminating programs that are not as popular. Syracuse just eliminated 90 programs, and they're kind of more in this moderately selective range. So these are just some examples of like some of these institutional priorities and choosiness in terms of the enrollment management's objectives when you have more butts and seats, more raw material to work from with a larger applicant pool. And then the colleges with the largest applicant pools and the least amount of spaces, the real winners, right? For themselves, not for everyone else. This is where, for most of these schools, tuition revenue, which, you know, I always say the biggest institutional priority is wealth. That is the biggest advantage to a person in the US college admission system, sadly. At highly selective colleges, that chip for many families kind of dissolves a little more than they are maybe comfortable with. Because having the ability to be a full pay student, it's going to vary very much from college to college. But for colleges that, for example, meet 100% of demonstrated need, they're usually not really as concerned with having a high amount of full pay students per se being the bulk of their admits. They can be more choosy with bringing in students who come from low income backgrounds who may not be able to afford it. And this is where you're going to be also getting a lot more of those mission and value-driven institutional priorities that are oftentimes related to the college's history and their strategic plan. So here are some examples of these institutional priorities, right? So these are directives from the college's leadership that the enrollment management team is bolstered with improving. These are just some examples divided by type of college or institution. So usually, I mean, a really short way to think about this is that it's oftentimes based on supply and demand. The less something is available in your applicant pool, and the more important it is to the college's leadership, the more proactive you're going to be with those types of applicants. So, you know, for institutes of technology, they're usually more proactive with female applicants than male applicants because they just have more men to choose from, and statistically, more men are applying to those schools. International students were right now facing, you know, a big issue where public education funds have flatlined or decreased for many states. So international students have often shared the burden of, you know, bringing in the full pay tuition revenue to keep a lot of these in-state flagships and public institutions afloat. So, you know, colleges are worried, right, about, you know, potential drops in international students based on that. A lot of Ivy Plus, you know, really, really hyper selective schools have had lots of conversations recently about increasing socioeconomic diversity. You've probably maybe heard of initiatives like the STARS network, which has many selective colleges that are banding together to really dial down their efforts on recruitment and retention of rural students. That's just, you know, one example of institutional priorities that it depends on the individual school and their college's leadership and how involved their faculty are, or pain points that they're noticing on their campus, that these priorities will wax and wane. And the admission leader, whoever is the dean of admission, is given kind of and very much in close conversation with the board of trustees, with the faculty, with the college's president, to determine what are these priorities each year and what am I going to direct my staff, the admission officers, to pay attention to. Tillie, is there anything coming up in the questions or things that I can clarify maybe now before we get too deep?
I think just eagerness to know whether or not the slides will be shared.
They will not be shared. If you take the course, you will get them. But we will be sharing the resources that are in the slides that are linked in them. So yes. So another question that may be coming up is like, how do I find out a college's institutional priorities? And my answer to you is focus your efforts on other things. It's not worth it. Many colleges are very gatekeepy with that information. They're worried about people gaming the system, creating fake applications, utilizing it in nefarious ways. Some schools, like for example, Vanderbilt just did a webinar for counselors where they really gave some real specifics as to these are things we're wanting to bolster. We want men in education. We want, you know, more local students. I forget if it was local students based on this grant. There are some colleges on the more highly selective end that are going to be more open about this, but just know that all the colleges on that best colleges list or whatever that you're seeing that students are coming to being like, I'm going to apply to all of these. They all have some version of this behind the scenes that they are more or less transparent about, depending on their institutional culture, comfort level, all these things. So speaking of, we talked about the office, the college, and the admission office, and the enrollment manager, that dean of admission. Now let's talk about the peons, Tillie and I.
Happy
So
peons.
in many ways, I think some people think that like admission officers have so much power and that they're like so hungry for it. I'm like, you really don't. Like, you are given directives from your college's leadership that you're like, here's your application pool of hundreds of students. Here are the things that we want you to look out for that are important to us this year. And we want you to bring forward students of that nature that have some element of this list of things, essentially, that from our data or from our projections, we want to increase enrollment to South Dakota, and we want bassoonists in the orchestra because we're losing them all because they're all going studying abroad. Those examples that you may have heard on webinars before are absolutely real. And I'd say they're especially more real for smaller colleges that have, for example, more percent of their student body being taken up of by things like varsity athletes. They don't have as much wiggle room to just admit generally talented students. Students have to fit a particular priority to truly be a competitive candidate. And Pomona, where I used to work, I'd say is a really good case study of that, because it's a very highly selective small school, and we have all these varsity D3 teams. Our early decision pool, yes, the acceptance rate on paper looks like a lot, but it's a lot of students coming in that are athletes, as well as a lot of Questbridge applications and Questbridge match students, which was so great in terms of the institution's goals to be a more diverse, equitable place. But anyway, scaling back to who admission officers are, they are and were people like Tillie and myself. Well, maybe now we're kind of like aging out of the mean age here. I know I am. I'm 33. But if you look at this chart here, it shows you who generally is working at admission offices. And as you've probably noticed, if you're a school counselor and AOs are visiting your school, generally they're going to be younger, and often there's a lot of turnover. So that's, I think, important just to remind your students and families of, is that the person who's reading this application is a college-educated individual who is adept at communication, and also adept at close reading and following directives in terms of, okay, I'm given this pretty big file of lots of different components: transcript, test scores, school profile, recommendation letters, essays, activities, and I'm going to synthesize from all this information the things that are most important to the college I work for based on my reader training. And I'm going to present and bring forward students that are a best match for what the college is telling me they want to see more of. So one thing I think that's really important to note here is that, as I kind of mentioned, the first bullet is really the summary of an AO's job. The second one is, I'd say, equally important, and it's, I think, important to remember that admission officers are also oftentimes, for many of these highly selective schools, territory management is one of the default ways that a college will divide up their reading process and management of who is assigned which applications. You're assigned applications based on states or regions of the world that you are asked to be more of a subject expert in. So, there are some schools, that have more major or program-based admission officers. I think Bucknell is one, for example. Certain AOs will be reading specifically in a committee for students for these majors and programs that require maybe more, or faculty might be involved. I think I want to say Caltech has a little bit of like faculty input at a certain stage in the reading process of, is this student Caltech level, for this major that they want to go into. But this is the job of the AO, is to really understand the regions that they are assigned to, understand the historical background of these regions and who's been admitted over the past couple of years. And how do they want to grow and change that region going forward based on, their, own intuition as an admission officer, as well as those larger top-down goals that they have to keep in mind. They're also speed readers. They read really quickly and move through material really quickly, which may be thinking that this is too. I think it's also important to acknowledge what admission officers are not. So something that I think is a great practical takeaway to share with your students is that a lot of times students want to like flex how smart they are by using really technical jargon, and they're speaking the language. For example, if they are really deep into machine learning research or biology, C. elegans worms that they're testing this protein on, and they're talking about it as if everyone and their mother knows what it is, and like no one knows what they're talking about. So that's something I think to be aware, is this younger AO reading this file needs like a more baseline pitch about what the student's academic interest and area is, it can still be, of course, sophisticated and show nuance and show critical thinking. But I just, the technical side, especially of some of these more STEM minded students, really needs to be reined in a little bit when these AOs are not people who are necessarily, they've not spent any time in these labs or with a lot of these concepts in depth in person in terms of their educational background or their professional life. They're not just admitting students that they like. This is sometimes a big misconception, is that you just need to be like likable. We're going to share some practical tips that I think can make an application more generally likable, but you can still like a student and like love their essay and love what they're talking about, and then be sending them to the deny pile because they don't meet any priorities for the school. So it's not as subjective as people think. You can't get away with just admitting students that you think are cool, because you have a lot more checks and balances built into the process to prevent that from happening. This is another big one, is like, they're also not just like looking for like low test score, deny quickly to make my workload easier. It's not that easy really and simple. And AOs instead are looking for like evidence from an application to build a case up from the bottom for why the student should be admitted. They don't really have to write all that much on their summary for this is why the admit decision is what it is. They don't have to say it's, you know, they don't have to write paragraphs and paragraphs essentially of why it's a no. They have to write more about why the student is a yes and have more evidence for that yes student. But for the no's, a lot of it can just be not standing out in the pool. And so I think sometimes some counselors and especially some parents and students will hyper fixate on like, oh, I didn't get in because this word choice in this essay, or because this singular breakdown of my ACT score was low. And usually it's not this small little thing that's like sending the application to a no pile. So I think dialing down the anxiety around that side of the process, hyper analyzing each and every single word and element and placing inflated weight on it, is an important counseling practice I want to just put out there. They're also not big old meanies wanting to crush dreams. That was part of the job that I liked the least. So most are actually like nice people who want to do right by, you know, students and families, but are tied to objectives that are a necessary part of their job. I think sometimes people misunderstand how data-driven this process is. So we're going to get into a lot with the case study today on how that actually takes shape in the process. I also think people underestimate the role of context in college admissions. It's a word that I remember I did a presentation a couple of years ago with AOs from Bowdoin and Penn, and it was when I was at Pomona. We did group travel in northern New England, and I remember we had a whole section about context, and like some like parent in the audience was like, "Why are you talking so much about this context word? Like, I don't know why it like everything seems to be coming back to it." And I'm like, because it kind of does. And the more you understand like how your application is read in context with other people from your individual high school, as well as your state or region, and then the application pool more broadly, those contextual comparisons are happening frequently at different stages in the reading process. But I think the first and foremost thing that you as counselors, especially the school-based counselors tuning into the call, need to be aware of is how can you equip the AOs from the colleges that your students are applying to with information about your school community, your course choices, limitations around accessing them. The more you can do with your school profile, with your letters of recommendation to help people in admissions understand if a student really is a superstar, if they're really going above and beyond what's available and offered, ideally, the information that you are providing on the school side is reflecting that. Because they are not going to go and chase you and email you and be like, I want to follow up about little Timmy here because I feel like he seems really cool and different from your school. They have too many applications to get through to go and do that individual outreach, unless something's really going to compel them to want to latch on to a certain student. But the more you can provide in terms of your immediate context about your school community, the better off your students are going to be in terms of having the AO understand what is available to them. So speaking of like reading applications, how do admission officers go through that speed read, and how do they kind of like have that checks and balances sense that I mentioned before, where it's not just I like the student a lot, like great essay about Funko Pops, admit. That's not really going to be, that's not going to fly for a selective college admission process. The application first needs to have a series of high or admissible ratings for the school's particular process based on a ratings rubric. that helps quantify certain pieces of a student's application based on things that are important to the individual institution. So what does this look like practically? This is actually a screenshot of an old reader form from Harvard from back when they had paper applications for an international student here. And you'll see lots of shorthand and abbreviation and hieroglyphics, if you will, that are like, I don't know what this means. You see some remnants of SAT-2 subject tests, I think, which is like, thank God those are not, we have a lot more things to worry about than that, but at least we can put those aside. Um, so it is something that I think I also want to acknowledge that sometimes people worry about like there is an arbitrary nature, right, of like who's reading your application, how tired they are that day. You'll hear anecdotes like that. Generally, I would say that that statistically is less less of a factor because of all these different checks and balances that are in the system built into it. There really is a deep reader training at the beginning of the application cycle where everyone who's on the staff who's reading, whether it's part-time, application readers, as well as full-time admission officers, have a shared understanding of, okay, if a 4 for academics is the highest, everyone should be reading the same application and giving it a 4 based on what objective criteria that they have. Or there should be very little wiggle room between people rating it a 3 to a 4. Tillie, I don't know if you want to speak to anything related to this piece of the presentation around like the norms among an admission staff of like, ideally you all get the same file and are rating the academic side or the personal side with the same rating or the same scale, because you're supposed to have a shared understanding as a staff of like, this is a 6, like, what a 6 looks like.
Yeah, and I think having been in multiple admission offices, some offices do a better job of what I call the norming process of helping officers early in the process, usually before you're really starting, understand and do the norming, right? So that we're all actually on the same page. Not everybody does as strong a job of that. Sometimes there's much more criteria. Sometimes the training manuals are much more thorough, or you have more samples to look at. So it can vary, and it depends on resources and staffing, but you don't have a lot of control over it either. You don't have any control over it. As counselors, we don't, and we have to trust our colleagues on the other side that they're doing the best, and they're constantly iterating. When you're working in an AO, you're trying to make these processes better. You're trying to make them more equitable. You're assessing them. If you're an office, worth your salt at the end of every season. So it's human error. We're trying to do different things, but I generally, I was working really hard. I'm sure you were, Tom, to make those processes better in the capacities that we can. But
oh, absolutely. And one practical example of that that's actually relevant to the case study that I'm going to walk you all through is when I was working at Pomona, we were really trying to think about, and huge kudos to the Pomona admission leadership for this, because there was a lot of worry among the leadership team, seeing kind of like politically where the country was going and concerns around how there may be, especially with everything that was happening with the Supreme Court decision, even before the decision actually went into effect, Pomona was preparing to basically be like, how can we bring in a class that reflects the diversity of students that we are as an institutional standpoint, based on our mission and our values and our strategic plan, how can we bring in that class and do it in a race neutral way? Because other systems like the UCs, when they were asked to do that based on state legislation, have really struggled to do that. They had big drops in enrollment of lots of racial and ethnic populations who have been underrepresented, in many colleges. So Pomona did a lot of work with legal teams to implement parts of our reading process and revise our rubric and rating scale to assess for these valued qualities, which I'm going to talk towards the end of this session about something called admission nutrients, which are essentially qualities that we've done an analysis at College SAI of like, okay, out of these hundreds of colleges and universities that are out there that are on the more selective end, what are things that they're saying in their materials and in their mission statements and their vision statements, strategic plans about what they care about? And there are many colleges that have elements of their reading process. Stanford on this slide is one of them. So you see a box for intellectual vitality. You're like, that seems a little like specific for these other general categories of like rec letters and school support or extracurriculars. Intellectual vitality is a huge part of the way Stanford discusses its identity as an institution. It's all over their materials. If you sit in on any presentation, you're probably going to hear that phrase. And it's essentially that concept of intellectual curiosity. You know, what are the questions that you as a student are hungry to answer? What keeps you up at night? What have you actively worked to pursue as a student? So Stanford specifically has an intellectual vitality rating in their process. And it's not just high school rigor and smart grades. It's truly that curiosity evidence that oftentimes is going to be garnered more through essays and through recommendation letter examples. You also see things like Harvard has like an athletic rating, which obviously like not everyone's going to get an athletic rating. That is put in their rubric and reading process to give points to recruited athletes. So that's something that, you know, the scales, like I wouldn't stress too much about this slide here. This is just to give you some examples of like how different schools will find these quantity buckets depending on what's important to them or what, you know, what they need to quantify in terms of their application components.
Tom, there was just a quick question about what
Yeah.
school support meant in the Harvard
Yep.
example. Is that
So that it's rec letters. It's, you know, how the school talks about the student. Yeah. So school, how supportive they are of their candidacy.
great?
So some questions that admission officer will be thinking about when they are looking at an application. When they're looking at that that record, you know, the transcript school profile, the basic question that they're asking themselves, and this is one that ideally you're maybe hitting in your recommendation letter for the student, what was available to the student based on the school profile, advanced course offerings, things like that, and what did the student like leave on the table and not take advantage of? So that's going to be something that will come up for a lot of these committee discussions for an individual college. Academics are first and foremost. You're going to find very few schools that are going to be reviewing other components first. They're usually going to want to make sure and assess that that student is academically viable. And usually for most of these highly selective schools, it's about 3/4 of their application pool, about 75%. So you want to make sure that student is getting that, you know, that checkpoint essentially and making it through that. With communicating their course choices and why they took certain courses that they did. If you are noticing like, oh, and AO might be wondering like, why did the student not take AP Calc? But the student has a really good reason for why it's scheduled, you know, there was a scheduling conflict or whatever. Ideally, they're putting that in their additional information section themselves. But then also, ideally, you're maybe spending some time pointing attention to it and corroborating the story on the school end, on the school support end. That goes along with recommendations. You know, how does the school see the student, especially right now in the age of AI, right? There is actually some evidence that we're hearing from different colleges that they're actually kind of looking back at rec letters and like school verifiability of like, here's the student saying that they are really into from their application. And ideally, there's alignment between what's being communicated on the rec side as well as what the student's saying. So I think that's important for everyone to be on the same page about. I'm just going to move through to the next slide, though, just because I feel like it's good to get to the actual process piece. So what is the actual process? What does the admission process look like at many of these schools? Well, one thing to note is that it really does depend on the individual college. But Tillie and I are going to just briefly describe two versions of how a highly selective college might process their application volume using different reading tactics or processes.
Thanks, Tom. And I'm trying to get to those questions, folks. You're sending such thoughtful ones, so I really appreciate it. We're trying to get there. So, in thinking about an application review process, and this comes from just my own experience at USC and also Whitman College. So I've seen kind of the big spectrum there, had a lot of exposure to the UCs as well. A lot of my career was in California. But this is just a sample, right? We can't possibly have insight into every school. So I just want to put the caveat that it's based on our own experiences and then also a lot of conversation with colleagues. So when you're at an institution of a pretty large size that's getting these kinds of numbers, right? 82,000 applications is a lot. That's the higher end. These numbers in particular are drawn just from USC's common data set, and I've read for them, so that's why I pulled that. But what's happening there is early in the year, and as Tom was mentioning, right, there can be very extensive training. USC's was fantastic. I was a part-time reader for them, and you're being hired, right? right? So they're hiring anywhere from 20 to 40 external readers, depending on how many apps they're anticipating. We're being onboarded early in the fall, very extensively. And then we're also sort of norming, right, with the admission staff. They're getting similar presentations that we're getting so that we're all on board, right? And we're all approaching things in a similar way. Institutional priorities were not shared with us as part-time readers, but at Whitman College, it's much smaller. Those were absolutely communicated. We did not have external readers, right? So it varies there, but regardless, you're doing that prep and training. And then you start reading, right? Pretty much as soon as those apps start trickling in and they're prepared, you are getting on the ball, it then sort of will evolve into, okay, we want you to get to anywhere from 40 to 300 apps a week, depending on what your responsibility is. And all that is tracked extensively in Slate. But what I want to clarify here is that there was a question actually in the chat about who is reading the application first, and that can vary dramatically. So I, as a part-time reader, sometimes we are the first one reading it. Sometimes we're reading just from a particular region or many regions, but often we're this kind of the first step. We're the first reader. We're taking a look. We're assessing it just like a territory manager would, and then sending it along to the second reader. Then there's the territory manager. These are always admission officers, right? Our external readers do not have that kind of control, but that territory manager is the person on the admissions staff responsible for literally a particular territory. It could be as big as California or the West Coast, or as granular as like Alameda County and Contra Costa County and Marin County, right? If you have a very big office and it's so large, you have so many apps that you are literally breaking things down into county. And it is your responsibility as the territory manager to literally manage that territory and understand what the trends are, understand what the feeder schools are looking like, how big the pools are, and sort of, how all that is parsing out based on those institutional priorities that you've been given. And sometimes the territory manager will be the first to see an application, right? If it could be particular scholarships that they're tracking, could sometimes be athletes if you don't have an athletic liaison, or other folks, maybe they're flagged for development or what have you. So sometimes there's that funnel happening. There's always going to be at least 2 readers. Sometimes they bring a third in if there's some question happening, or let's say they want the perspective of an athletic liaison. So, but there's guaranteeing those 2 reads for sure. And then there are committees happening, right? So it's typically, we don't just have one generally because there's so much volume to get through. Typically, part-time readers are not part of that. The territory managers are there, the admission office leadership. And as Tom was saying, like, you can show up and advocate, right? You kind of go in, you know what your list is. Maybe you're just doing particular regions, or you're just talking about kids on the bubble that day, or you're talking about, you're confirming, okay, who we're dropping, or you come in and they're saying, okay, we're cutting today. So here are your lists, and I need you to get rid of 3 girls, 3, white women who have X amount of financial need. There were conversations literally like that. And then you go back to your office and you trim, and your heart breaks. And then you go back or maybe, but the beautiful thing, what I'll say about a process like that at a place like Whitman, it's not happening, maybe it's happening at SC, but I'm not in that room. And I'm sure it is. But for some of those students on the bubble, even as a junior AO, junior, you at a place like Whitman, you could still fight and win, right? You could still bring that kid who is really compelling and say, I really think they have what it takes, right? And make your case to AO leadership, which is kind of a beautiful thing. That doesn't happen all the time. But often there's that interplay happening throughout the months. Those are usually starting in like late January and February. And then there comes to shaping, where you've kind of made your biggest decisions, you've met your goals. And folks, keep in mind this data, you're getting updated data from your data wonks like all week, every day. It's updating constantly as new applications are read and filed. But ultimately, you're doing this shaping at the end where it's okay, it's those last two. We need to drop five from LA County, or we need a couple public school students to come up, or we're looking for men in education. Let's dip down,
Yeah.
lower in GPA than we normally would because we need to
Yeah.
bring some of those kids up. Like Vandy might say that, right? Or
Yeah.
so it's kind of it's a beautiful, fascinating process. Depends on the criteria.
Yeah.
But that's what kind of a classic app review process is. And then Tom's going to talk about a newer process. It's not that new now, I guess,
Yeah.
but it still feels
And
kind of new. It was a big deal when
totally.
it all came out.
Yeah.
So.
And it's similar in many ways to what Tillie just described. And I think the commonality, regardless of how you divvy up the work, is it's a data-driven process based on your pool, a classification and recordings of metrics like, are we low on Pell students? It's very much driven by these reports. And I think that is a commonality across lots of different admission offices, no matter how they're dividing up the actual work and getting it done and who's doing the work. Is it part-time readers or full-time staff, et cetera? So my experience working at admissions at Holy Cross, I was a sole territory reader for many applications. I actually also, as a first reader, was based on alphabetical last name. So I just had W, X, Y, and Z students from all over the world, which is kind of cool. At Pomona, which is the process that you're seeing here, it's very heavy on the full-time admission staff and less so on the part-time reading staff. And so Pomona is dividing up files using a process called CVE, where there's a driver and a passenger. And the driver is oftentimes, it will be different from college to college, but it's usually someone that is focusing a little bit more on the academic side of the student's candidacy, whereas the passenger is someone who's focusing more on the essays, the activities, the Common App side of the student's file. Sometimes at some schools, maybe that includes the rec letters. And then after reading through all of those applications, say you have like 800 or so in your queue that's assigned to you as a driver. You're the driver on all the files from your states that you read for. Then you have a few, maybe 100 or so of those that have been flagged from that initial reading as potential admits or waitlists. And then you're going to run a lot of data on your regions. For me, it was Washington State and Oregon, and look and see, okay, am I really high in men for the state? Am I really low on public schools, or, and whatever it may be? And then you're going to make some adjustments to your recommendations of admits and waitlists based on that. Then you bring files to full committee, have a larger discussion where you read out basically a summary of it's like you're going to court and you're like, this is my rationale for why the student should be admitted. And you're citing actual quotes from recommendations, from essays, high points of praise and ratings for the student. And having that discussion in committee settings. And then, as Tillie said, shaping things at the end. Oftentimes that's the leadership who's deciding we're low on our average SAT score, so we're going to knock out some kids who have low reading scores in the final composition of the class. That's kind of when the reports are really driving a lot of where you're going to whittle down and sculpt this class out a little more. So this is just a little short video to help you help illustrate how context really guides admission decisions. And it's saying error, so we're going to move from that because we don't have time. But we can share this with you later in the notes. This is an example of a reader's screen and slate, which is a system that many colleges use to read applications. I want to actually show you kind of say you are doing committee-based evaluation. This is actually a video from, his name is Andrew Hoffman. He's a former admission rep from Swarthmore and a few other schools. And he has a lot of great content on YouTube that kind of really reveals this behind the scenes, behind the curtain admission process, particularly the committee-based evaluation system. So here's just a little sneak peek of what a conversation between two AOs, a driver who's managing a territory, in this case it's Louisiana, and a passenger who's just there as a second admission officer who has their own territories that they're worrying about. But today, they're reading as a fresh set of eyes to give their perspective on the qualitative parts of the application.
Okay, ready to read some files? Ready as I'll ever be. Great. We're going to get through 35 files this morning, which is about 12 files an hour, and we're going to start in Louisiana. And you're ready for the passenger role, right? Just as long as you drive. Great. First up, we have Noah Douglas from Catholic in Baton Rouge. You can see on the dash that we get a number of applications from this school each year, around 10 or so. Noah's toward the top of the school group. He's interested in biology and computer science, has a 1540 SAT, had a dance rating of 2, and is applying for our Service Learning Scholarship Program. Any questions? And how are we doing in Louisiana this year? We're fine. We're pretty popular in New Orleans and Baton Rouge. We already have a number of ED admits, and we're typically admitting a student from Catholic each year. Obviously, it depends on the pool. Okay.
So that gives you a sense of like, before you even dive into a file, what might be some questions the admission officers are asking each other about this student, their context, the region that they're coming from. Those are really top of mind for grounding the conversation in local context. So I'm actually going to show you what I'm calling a super application. And the reason I'm saying that is because, I shouldn't have done stop share. I should have minimized my window. Sorry, excuse me. The reason I'm calling this a super application is because this application is a conglomerate. It is a mixture of 2 different applicants who have worked with the college SAI team over the years. So one is a student that I actually worked with. Oh, I'm behind my blurred. So one is a student that I worked with as a college essay specialist. And the student academically, we're using the student's academics essentially to show you this simulation. And these were all the schools that he was admitted to. So obviously very, very strong academic student. And then these, we're mixing kind of that academic side with an equally strong student academically, but just for the sake of this demo, he was admitted to this range of schools. So obviously great raw material that we're sharing with you. But I actually put together, and this is something that's kind of like new this year, is, as I mentioned before, Slate is the application reader that many colleges use. This is essentially a fake Slate, let's call it Flate, that is kind of meant to show you basically like if you're an AO, this is like kind of what your computer screen looks like when you're pulling up a file. You generally have a dashboard that's essentially kind of like a breakdown of like some of the most important data points that you'd want to know. So things like, this student's ACT score, which is a 33. And my first question is going to be, okay, do I have information from the school if I go to school profile here on the left of what a high, test score is for this regional context? And we're looking through the school profile. We're seeing if there's any test score data. Oh, look, okay, we're seeing that the mean score is the 34 or 23. So that's a really high score. I'm just hypothetically going through this. This is not me saying like everyone goes to test score first. You'll also usually have something called school history, where you're going to be looking at, for example, like all the students who've applied from this particular high school that this student, Tom Campbell, is applying from, Glenn Academy in Brunswick, Georgia. Here are all the students from the past who've applied, filtered by year. And it gives you a sense of, for this high school, what are that number of AP classes the student's taking, for example. And the student that we're looking at now, we're seeing that he took 19 AP classes. So across our school history here, he probably would get a really strong academic rating, right? Because and this is me very quickly going through this, but he's really above and beyond what most students in his immediate context are doing when it comes to academics. So I'd go to, for example, my reader form and probably give him a 4, for his academics based on what I have available to me from this context. As a driver of the file, the person academically reading it through it, this is predominantly what I'm spending my time doing, is this academic assessment. I might also be going to the recommendation letters to be trying to get a sense for, okay, who is the student in the school? Can I get some, specific things that I can read out when I'm bringing the student forward to committee? And this is where those qualities that I mentioned before, what I'm calling the admission nutrients. At Pomona, we actually had to mark evidence of valued qualities that are important to Pomona. They're still on Pomona's website. I believe they may still be actively used in the reading process. You'd mark, essentially, part of our reading process was assessing how much these qualities were coming out in the file. And we really couldn't bring forward students who are below average in a lot of these areas. So I'm reading through this rec letter here, for example, and we have this detail here of like, Tom's in the top 3% of graduating class. He's taking all these classes. He's doing graduate level work. So we're really getting a lot of evidence across these different components that he's above and beyond when it comes to academics. I'm reading his teacher recommendation right now, and I'm seeing all these specific details about like ways that he is going above and beyond the class material. He's asking these probing questions. This one here about George Orwell. I'm looking and seeing there's a section here in the rec letter where he's like, oh, in our unit on The Handmaid's Tale, Tom was paired with Marcus, a student whose political sensibilities differed from him, but they really collaborated really well on the project. If collaboration and working with others, working across differences is an important quality to the college and their mission statement, their value statement, I'm going to mark that probably above average, in this reading process for this simulated school. So the passenger, meanwhile, though, for the CBE reading process is going to be reading through these essays, this qualitative side of things. And I know for the sake of time, I was going to go into a lot more of these in detail and read some of these essays of this student. But this is a file that we'll be diving into in a lot more depth in the highly selective course. And it is based on, again, these conglomerates of students that we've worked with who have had really great objective outcomes when it comes to many highly selective schools noticing and valuing and seeing things that they're communicating in their file. Something that I'm going to point out just to note to you in terms of practical takeaways to share with students and families is this essay, when you read through it, one thing that's standing out to me is a lot of puns. I felt very out of place. It's an essay that if you read through it, it's essentially about kind of different lessons that the student has learned from the grocery store. You get a little bit of his family life from this and family dynamics, his role in his family. You get a little bit of, he talks about kind of conversations that he's had at the grocery store with different diverse groups of people. He's showing this intellectual curiosity when he's asking these questions. Why do Asian shoppers often ask for 2 vertical cuts in a rack of ribs? And he ends this with this cute little only time will tell. So I show this to kind of show you that this is something that sometimes people can be fearful of, is a more playful presentation in an admission office. But this is a process that's really rooted with a lot of serious metrics and data. And oftentimes when an admission reader is getting to the qualitative side of things, the humanity and kind of a little bit more of less of a rigid here's all my AP classes and here's all these things, that's being communicated through all these different other data points and metrics and reports and being quantified and put into this reader form for them. But the actual application itself and the essays are really where at this stage in the game, and the recommendation letters too, where you can really kind of be getting some of these points about the human qualities that the student is bringing forward when some of these objective things may be more out of their control. Okay, I know that was really, really quick, but I want to be sure to just leave some of these final slides for you. So for these on the bubble candidates, this is something that many people ask, okay, a lot of the applicants that I work with, they are really, really strong in many ways. But I don't know how to really practically help them out. I'd say on your end as a counselor, if you manage a school profile, that's a big area. I'm sharing in the resources here are really what I would say is a great school profile that really kind of gives that school context really thoroughly. But if a student that you're working with is kind of what my wonderful colleague Susan Tree uses the term standard strong in college admissions. So this is a session at NACAC this past year that she presented on that was actually asked to be presented twice because so many people were wondering, how do we get these standard strong students to be competitive in this process when many of them are looking very similar to one another in these application pools. I'd say those humanity glimmers that I kind of showed really briefly on that qualitative side of the application are definitely one way to do that. I would say the admission nutrients of college essay guys, one of our big resources, is another one for that. Sorry, let me go back here. There, something forward. So these qualities here are ones that across the board, many colleges have cited that these are very important things to them. So if students are writing essays and creating applications with these qualities in mind and finding opportunities to showcase anecdotes of them across their application opportunities, across their personal essay and their school-specific supplemental essays, that's when they're going to really, I'd say, have their best chance of fit and alignment with a particular college. So we are running close on the hour, so I do unfortunately have to wrap up. But do know that the analysis kind of that I showed you of that simulated fake slate and reading through applications in that way, that is something that is going to be a big focus of the course this year. I've taught this course for several years, and there's 3 parts to it. It's called Helping Students Apply to Highly Selective Colleges. And compared to these webinars where we're trying to get as much information out there to hundreds of people, but it is really difficult to get these individual nuanced questions answered. I'll stay a little bit longer on this webinar to do that, but just want to honor people's time for the actual content delivery. The 3 sessions are kind of divided into, the first one is a little bit more about the theory of highly selective admissions, a little bit of kind of the content that we presented during the beginning of the course, but just more in depth, more time for specific questions that you have about how this takes shape in your own individual community, with your own practice, with your own students. And then we talk a lot more in the beginning, middle session about, okay, let's go through rec letters. Let's go through, academics. Let's go through activities lists. What are some do's and don'ts, some practical suggestions, exercises, examples you can share with your students about what it takes to be a competitive applicant at these highly selective schools. And then the last day is where we're kind of diving in and pretending to be admission officers and going through files like the one that I just showed you before, where everything's included in there, the student's transcript, their recommendation letters, their essays, and you take notes on each of the students' file to kind of gain some takeaways for students that you're working with. Other things that are featured in the course, you do have the option to actually send in current or former student work, and I'll go through and look through and read. I won't do this for every single participant, but it is a nice piece of the course of being like, okay, let's actually spend some time diving into real case studies that you're struggling with, or maybe you had a student last year that you're like, I don't know why their results were not as strong as I would have expected it to. Kind of going to dive into maybe what went wrong. Oftentimes it's nothing, as we talked about before. It's probably institutional priorities, but what might there be some ways to elevate the material and have it have its best chance of grabbing the attention of that reader who's moving through it very quickly. Do a lot more deep dives into the behind the scenes of reading process. And I also do a lot of answering of individual questions with links and resources. And I really spend a lot of time like with my class, I guess, that runs over 3 weeks, really helping make sure that you feel as supported as possible. And you're getting that personal attention that sometimes is harder on some of these, group sessions. So on that note, I do want to stay on for a few questions. Tillie, do not feel pressure to stay on. If you have other things to do with your evening, you are free to go. But I'm going to stay on and answer some questions that are coming up. If there's any big ones that you think I should hit based on, what you're reading, that'd be great.
Yeah, there are well, I think, and I think maybe you answer this, just someone asking about specific updates, additions, or differences, someone who really enjoyed the course last time. So
Oh, the course.
you feel like
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So I will say, if you have taken the course before, there isn't a whole lot that is like fundamentally different about the course and what is being offered. The kind of dashboard system that I showed before is newer, and we have, some new files that we're going to be talking about. Probably talk about this one here more in depth, this synthesis Tom Campbell, fake student from Glenn Academy. But if you have taken the course before, it's not something that I'm like, I think you should be necessarily spending 3 weeks of your life doing it. But if you are new, it's definitely, I'd say, worth the time.
And then this is a little bit granular, but this has to do with sort of test optional and how much that's playing into decisions, all other things being equal. But we've talked about those different things, but in other webinars, certainly. Another person's asking if you're going to discuss specific priorities that top schools have mentioned, like the Vanderbilt example.
I can actually do that right now. Institutional. In the course, we talk a lot, about this. And one thing that I think I mentioned is that there's not like a database or like a sheet to be handed to someone to be like, here they are. But just one, I was giving a similar presentation a few days ago, and this is some examples of, some more recent schools that have come forward and talked about some priorities that are important to them. So Duke, Vanderbilt, Case Western, here are some examples of things that they've mentioned. So if schools are putting on counselor webinars, that's a really great chance to even explicitly ask colleges. Some will be more transparent than others, again, but it's worth your time and energy and investment if you can make time for these counselor webinars, because they're usually going to be more public with you than maybe necessarily something that's open to everyone, to students and families. Carnegie Mellon, they sent out an email. At this point, it was a couple of years ago, but I still think that they're actively looking for more humanities students. And they actually mentioned that they have this new center and new money and investment in these departments and programs. So, that's one example of many schools that are looking for more humanities students on the highly selective end that have genuine documented fit to major interest.
Awesome. And then now the link to register is in the chat. So thank you so much, Ray, for doing that. Yeah, I think, well, do you want to do one or two more, Tom? Some of these are a little bit more, they're just niche, but people are
Yeah,
asking questions.
I saw a lot of questions about AI.
Yeah.
And I my conversations, and Tillie, I think you can please chime in, but
Yeah.
my conversations with friends of mine who are still actively working in admissions as directors now and some deans and is that there's not this en masse use of AI in the actual reading process for many schools. I imagine there's probably some degree of it, maybe more than they're publicly putting forward, but not like I'm saying that, and I don't want it to be like Tom said this on a webinar. Now everyone's doing it secretly. It's probably less than people think, at least at this current stage and point in time. We've heard about schools like Virginia Tech, for example, using it to screen essays, at least in one capacity. So there are some pieces that are mentioning it. I imagine some of the more administrative work, like for example, pulling data, from applications and putting it into dashboards that I'm showing you here. There's probably some degree of that happening, right? How can I synthesize things that are included in the information that used to take a little while in terms of my reading runtime to find and to put it into my reader form and my notes? I imagine there's probably schools who are iterating on how to put that down or scale that back down so that the majority of the read it can lower their reading times and focus more of it on the qualitative side of like sifting through what's being sent from the rec letters and from the essays.
And you can even go to Slate. We talked a little bit, well, maybe a lot about AI in webinars of late, just because it's so top of mind. But Slate has integrations. I think it's only going to get more sophisticated. But you can go to Slate's website if you're interested and actually see screenshots of the ways that it's being used. Some of it I think is like not particularly useful yet for AOs. It wouldn't be for me as I was reading, but they're pretty transparent about what that could look like, and we won't always know how schools are how they're using it, but at this point we do not have any confirmation that AI is making any final decisions on any students, so we can live with that. And then Tom, there's a question here: can counselors register for the course? On the page it says it's for students and families. Is that right?
Ooh, it should say it's for counselors, but hopefully. Oh, this is an old on-demand course. Sorry. Thank you for catching that. The actual course should be helping students apply. So this is the actual registration link. Maybe I can delete out the previous on-demand one. And then the offer as well, I'll just leave this in the chat too, for a discount for webinar attendees, thank you for coming, is in here. Or actually, Ray, I don't know if you're able to share this in the chat as well. That would be great. The behind the scenes of this webinar. Speaking of behind the scenes.
The curtain is pulled back.
Any other big questions coming up that you feel like thematically I could touch on in like a macro answer?
I think not really from the macro lens. I think we did what we could and we tried to get to as many as possible. Some of these are pretty niche. Some of them we have answered in others. So I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody's, but this has just been delightful, and it's nice to see our colleagues and be with such thoughtful peers in this industry, folks. So thank you so much for joining us.
I think a practical tip and advice that I think I had a slide for, but I don't know if I explicitly communicated it, is given that colleges are using data, hopefully as this presentation, so front and center with their admission process, it behooves you as a counselor to keep track and record of students who have applied to various colleges. What majors are they selecting? What round are they going for? I mean, this sounds maybe surface level, but met with enough people who are like, we're not actually, tracking or keeping a sense of like academically what students are putting down. We were able to make some, I'd say, great counseling suggestions to students at Lakeside when I worked there, based on looking at data of, okay, we're looking at our really powerhouse women in STEM applicants, and they're kind of being slashed left and right equally as the men at a lot of these highly selective schools. But at Cornell, we're still seeing more movement. And this was a few years ago. So again, institutional priorities change. This is one specific high school. It's all rooted in that individual school context. But we were able to make correlation, causation, ambiguous recommendations that we felt were more sound and grounded in data than just a hunch or an inference or some other student from another high school or another area that's not related to your own school data. So given that colleges are tracking so much of this, the more you can kind of play their game and keep record of your students and do some analysis on them, spend some time digging into that, I think the better counseling you can offer to your students and families.
Yeah.
Thank you again for tuning into the webinar. And Tillie, thank you so much for holding it down in the chat and questions.
I
So
tried.
appreciate having you on here. And thank you, Ray, as well, for being here too.
Yes.
Hope to see many of you on the course, because again, there's a lot more individualization that comes when you're spending hours and hours with me. Just careful what you wish for. But I think it's a pretty good time, and I really like to share this insight with people as much as I can. So thank you.
Yeah. Share and share alike. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.